Hello and welcome to The Right Idea, where we discuss the people, politics, and policies that drive Texas. I'm your host, Brian Phillips. I'm the comms guy here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and my co-host is Derek Cohen. As always, he's the Vice President of Policy, so he's the one who actually knows more about these things, so we'll get his take on the legislative session here in a little bit. How's it going, Derek?
Can't complain. It's actually not 80 degrees outside anymore, a little more typical for late January.
But there is a buzz in the air. There's certainly a buzz. Things are feel like they're moving. The up and down Congress. There's all the members are in town and staff are coming out, and the lunch places are filled with folks. So there definitely is a buzz in Austin. People excited about legislative session starts. So right when everybody gets excited, they recess for the week and they all go home. What was that about?
Well, again, we're still in that 60-day window where they're constitutionally prohibited from substantively advancing legislation. Also, just want to point out that thus far only the Senate seems to have actually assigned committees. I don't believe that the House's preferences were due until this week. And that being said, we're still probably a couple weeks out from when we're going to find out who's doing what in the House.
So it's a lot of hurry up and wait and happy hours and lunches and that kind of thing.
Well, I wouldn't know about that.
Okay. All right, well, let's run down what we're going to talk about in the show real quick so our audience knows. Later in the show, we're going to go in-depth on the issue of gender modification of minors, a very controversial issue. We'll talk about that. There's going to be legislation that's going to be filed, pending legislation that's going to be filed here pretty soon. So we'll talk about how members are addressing that particular issue. For the topics, for our hot topics, we're going to talk about, the Texas economy is on fire, apparently. We got some news about the Texas economy and talk about what that means. And then one Democrat in the House has a very interesting idea when it comes to teacher pay and getting teachers a massive raise. So we'll talk about some of the ins and outs of that. But first, I do want to give a shout out. I want to give a shout out particularly to our video team here at TPPF, specifically the man behind the magic, Jefferson Drexler, who produces this show, which is fantastic, but also Ariana Silva, who actually makes sure that Jefferson does a really good job. She's kind of our quality control on that, of course. And then really the man behind it all is Stephen Robinson. He's the head of our film department. And so if you haven't checked out our YouTube page, I would ask you to go there to TPPF's YouTube page. We have tons of really good videos on all kinds of issues. So thank you, Jefferson, for all the good work that you do as well.
Another California refugee.
Yeah, exactly. Another California refugee. It's not just Chuck DeVore, but we've got lots of them. In fact, we'll talk about that in the topics this week. As part of the reason why our economy is so crazy is because everybody's moving here. A couple other things for housekeeping. We love your feedback. We're getting a lot of good feedback. We're getting a lot of good constructive criticism of our ability to hold this show together. And so we're out in the Twitterverse. Both Derek and I are. You can find me at RealBphil. So we'll be promoting our show and promoting our various podcasts from there. You can give us all your constructive feedback and good words. But if you have criticism and you want to be a hater, please tweet at Derek at Cohen at TPPF, Cohen AT TPPF. He says that he told me on good authority that the hate really fuels him.
Yeah, exactly. It's the whole, your booze sustained me, because I've seen what you cheer kind of thing.
But we do really want your feedback. We certainly want your ideas if there's certain issues and things like that you want us to see covered, or you have questions about what's going on at the Capitol or going on with particular legislation. We're here to provide that information. We try to come up with topics that we think are, topical in the news, that kind of thing. But if there's something that you kind of want to hear about or want to hear us address, please hit us up on Twitter at RealBphil and at Cohen at TPPF. The last bit before we get into the show is I do want to talk about next week. We are thrilled. We're going to have our first guest on the show. Not that Derek and I can't hold it together for for 30 minutes, but we are super excited. We announced a couple weeks ago that former Congresswoman Mayra Flores is now part of TPPF, and she's out there advocating for these conservative policies, for conservative values. She takes on a number of different issues, not the least of which are things like parent empowerment, and then obviously issues at the border. She represented several border communities when she was a congresswoman. She's now here at TPPF. She's going to be in the building next week on Thursday, and so we asked her to join us. So she's going to have super hot takes on all kinds of issues. What do you think about Mayra?
Oh, I'm looking forward to it. Her perspective, not only from her time in D.C., but from her time, down in the Valley, is going to be one that's critically informative to the discussions that we're going to have going forward, not least of which on the issues of immigration and border security.
So looking forward to that. So we'll change up the way we do the show a little bit next week and basically just give her the floor because she's awesome. Looking forward to talking to her. So now, of course, the reason you're all here is to find out what's going on at the Capitol. Our first segment of every show is, of course, to hand it over to Derek and Derek's Lege-Land, what I like to call his Lege-Land update. So tell us what's going on this week at the Capitol.
Well, you said it was a little hurry up and wait. It's actually, we're starting to see some activity there. In fact, we actually had a committee hearing yesterday, really starting off that whole opening foray into the redistricting to repass the maps. That hearing started yesterday. And then starting next Monday, or this coming Monday, I should say, we're actually going to have our first Senate Finance hearing. And so we talked about the budgets getting announced last week. Mm-hmm. Well, we're actually going to start discussing it, and so we're going to start winding their way through. I believe next week they're only going to get through Articles 1 and 2. Mm-hmm. So that's going to get through the general government and health and human services. But that means that Monday following that is going to be Article 3, and that's education. So that's going to be a very, very informative hearing, I'd say, especially because a lot of the stuff we're talking about here, whether it's parental empowerment, whether it's some of the content in
school financing,
and that's going to cover all of that.
Yeah.
And so you're going to see recriminations and criminations, pre-criminations. All that's going to be, not Monday next, but the Monday following.
Okay. All right. So two huge, we obviously, two huge issues, finance and education. That's coming up. We also had the announced committees, which yes. For the insiders, I'm sure that for our audience who follows this kind of stuff, that was a big deal. I mean, there were probably not as many surprises as you might think. But what was your take on the committee assignments and how things are shaping up?
So you're right. They did announce committees in the Senate. Again, I believe today is the due date, at Thursday being the due date for preferences in the House. Mm-hmm. So we're still a couple weeks off from those particular announcements. But in the Senate, you're right. We didn't really see anything that was terribly surprising. There's a lot of folks who like to try to divine the goat entrails on what they come. So you to say if this person's vice chair versus that person, that means that this one tangential policy proposal either now has it used to be a 65% chance of passing, and now it's 65.3, or something like that. It's such a distal thing, and I think committees and committee chairs are very important, obviously, but we kind of get in these cul-de-sacs on discussing whether certain individuals are, right for a committee or not. Or, you hear a lot of talk about whether we're talking about Democrats or Republican committee chairs. And I think that's an important analysis, but it's a secondary analysis to an individual's philosophy on running a committee, first of all. And secondly, also on their actual ideological center. Mm-hmm. Because I can, just thinking back in recent history alone, I mean, how many conservative priorities were stymied in the House. I'm talking actually, things that, say the Republican Party would call, a priority legislation.
Yeah. Things like taxpayer-funded lobbying and bail reform and stuff like that.
Absolutely. Some of that stuff would be actually would go to one of the, to a committee chaired by a member of that party. Mm-hmm. And then it would still fail to get wings. And so I think that that's an important analysis, but it kind of misses the point of, working within an institution is its own set, it comes with its own set of rules, and I think it's a bit overly simplistic to reduce it thus.
And written or unwritten, right, in terms of the rules. Because some on the right have made an issue about, appointing Democrat chairs, right? Yeah. And there was one in the Senate. And so, but to your point, there's not always a guarantee that just because Republicans are in charge or because you have a Republican chair that the conservative priorities are going to get done.
Absolutely. And you mentioned, Dean Whitmire from the Senate. Mm-hmm. And yeah, he's been in the Senate for as long as I've been alive. And I pointed out the other day that he's actually been chairing criminal justice in the Senate for about half the time many of my staff have been alive, which is not the...
It just makes you old.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's more not an indictment of him, but an indictment of me. But that being said, it's also... there's a value on institutional knowledge there, institutional knowledge there as well. At the end of the day, I think the important thing is you take a look at what are important conservative priorities. Are they advancing or not? And looking at some of the ancillary characteristics, I think could be a bit of a distraction. But again, eye on the prize. If you have a conservative priority, is that moving? Is that gathering momentum? Is that getting to the other chamber with time for them to consider it as well?
And we'll find all that out here in the in the coming weeks. And obviously, as you said, coming up, we've got a very important education committee hearing that will be having. Is that the Senate?
Yeah, it's Senate Finance, but they're going to be doing Article 3 of the budget.
Okay, got it. Okay, great. All right, well, let's keep our eye on the ball, and we will get into the hot topics of the week. We got a couple things that we want to chat about. This week, there was good news about Texas. I think there was the Bureau of Labor Statistics released their job numbers for 2022, and Texas was the big winner. Texas had created the most jobs of any state in the country last year. In 2022, Texas added 650,000 jobs were created in Texas last year, again making us the king of job creation, again making Texas the economic engine of this country. What do you make of that?
Well, I think, it goes to follow. I mean, there's so many, we like to, especially some of the more, I would say, beard stroking amongst us, especially on our economist pals, our former colleague and current friend Vance Ginn, is always one to really give a multifaceted explanation for why the Texas's economy does as well as it does. But the thing is, it's even more simple than that. So much of the economic growth that we've developed or that we've experienced is because when businesses look at Texas, either for relocation or a place
expansion,
to
things like that,
exactly. They're not looking at, they're definitely not looking at the allergen count around here, I think we can all say.
But stifling humidity and heat.
Yeah, exactly. In the Houston area.
We would have got 1 million jobs.
Yeah, exactly. But they're not looking at that. They're looking at, do I have predictable regulation? Do I have a predictable tax rate? Is there not an area of my balance sheet I'll just go flying off the chart out of control? Can I plan and develop for success? Mm-hmm. And in so many states where, again, it's almost fashionable, sorry, Jefferson, almost fashionable to dunk on California, they can't say that. They can't say that. Look, they passed AB 5, which basically completely recodifies and rearranges an employee's relationship with their employer. It's obviously a sop to the unions.
California did that?
We don't have any of that. People here, not only do they reject that outright, it's like we don't even engage in those particular conversations. The only time you see, the typical union activism that you see so oftentimes in California, when you see it here, it's at a press conference and they're proposing something like, let's raise the minimum wage to $1,000 an hour and so everyone can be rich or something like that. And then that press conference ends and so too does the prospect of that legislation.
Yeah.
And so, this week we've seen press conference after press conference after press conference. And a lot of that is surrounding things that we want to talk about, but not things that, there's a consensus on doing. Mm-hmm. And so that's something that I just point out just simply because it generates a lot of smoke. Mm-hmm. But usually there's not a whole lot.
So you presented more of the an academic formula for why the Texas miracle, right? Because we have an educated workforce, we have regulations and all that kind of stuff. I kind of want to spike the ball a little bit and be a little petty. I mean, because we hear all the time, we pass legislation, we pass gun rights legislation, right? Like constitutional carry, or we have open carry here. Oh, it's going to be a Wild West in Texas. People are going to be shooting at each other from across Congress Avenue, or we pass abortion restrictions, and everybody's like, oh well, it's going to be this conservative hellhole, or election integrity reforms, or voter suppression. We're going to have all these people. And why would you ever move to Texas? Why would everybody here is complaining about Texas and they want to leave and go somewhere else? Well, that's not true. It didn't happen. It's not happening at all. And for a lot of reasons. Obviously some of the ones that you talk about, which is why the jobs are all being created here. But those jobs can't be created if people aren't coming here in droves, and they're coming here from places like California and Illinois and New York, places where they have stifling regulations, and like you're saying, and they have have less freedom. Meanwhile, we are passing conservative legislation here, and it is not preventing anybody, is not discouraging anybody from moving here, as we have a huge population growth in Texas. So anyway, it's just worth pointing out that that the left will criticize Texas for what it does in terms of its policies and its conservative leadership here, and clearly that is not the case.
Absolutely. And, me and my friends joke, usually over some brown leaf and brown liquor. We usually talk about how...
Those are cigars, right? I'm just okay, I got it.
Exactly. I was about to say that, now that they can still do that in California. Okay. But that being said, we joke about, the central to the Texas experience is basically dignity. Even people of modest means can live what we would consider a privileged life in many other places in this country, to say nothing about elsewhere in this world. And that's mostly because of the low cost of living, the low cost of, or the low regulation on doing what you want around here. And it's just great to see.
It's freedom. It's freedom.
Absolutely.
So we're competing with places like Florida and others for this kind of economic investment, and Texas seems to be winning. So that's great. Issue number 2, and we'll talk about this. I've got some really hot takes here, so we may hopefully we can get through it all. But I saw this proposal, and this is from Representative James Tallarico from Austin, and he's got a proposal to raise teacher pay, right? I mean, great. I mean, I'm certainly not opposed to teacher pay. He's proposing a $15,000 pay raise for Texas teachers and a 25% pay raise for other school employees using state surplus funds. Just as an idea, do we have any issue with raising teacher pay in Texas?
In a vacuum, not at all. The only thing I'd point out is that that's not the business of the legislature. So not only...
Wait. So they can't do this? This isn't... So...
The legislature can and has in the past and does currently in statute, and this is what Mr. Tallarico's bill seeks to alter, sets a factored minimum pay for teachers. And some folks bump up against it, some folks do not. It's the same thing where we talk about, here in Texas, the federal minimum wage. There are especially in this economy, there are very, very few people in Texas making the federal minimum wage. And so it's, this was another one of those press conferences we've seen this week. I'm all for giving teachers raises, but there needs to be some mechanism by sorting out quality in there too.
Yeah.
We've discussed ad nauseum on this podcast, parental empowerment. I would love to have a system where, whether it was promulgated by the legislature or not, where we have a system where there's some sort of quality control, some sort of quality assessment metrics on teachers, and those who do basically categorize into a higher pay tier outside of just they've been doing this job for X number of years, which is basically how the formula is currently constructed.
Right. I think it brings up some troubling questions, frankly, about the current crop of teachers that we have in Texas. A couple of things. We have these 3 statistics that are just like punching us in the face every single day when we talk about education in Texas. One is that 70% of our 4th graders cannot do math at grade level. 2, 70% of our 4th graders cannot read at grade level. And 3, if you cannot read or do math at grade level by the time you reach 4th grade, 95% of those kids will never catch up. So the quality of the product or the quality of the service, I hate to even use those terms, but the quality of the education is poor. I mean, we're not, if only 30% of our 4th graders are reading and doing math at grade level, we have a real problem. So what does this say? We're just, and again, I don't have a problem with giving teachers more money. I certainly don't know how, teachers can survive to live in places like Austin and Houston and Dallas and our major metro areas on those kinds of salaries. So just, in a vacuum, I don't have a problem with giving them more salary. But what does this mean? I mean, this is, our education system is not delivering the way it should, and so we're just going to give teachers $15,000 for what? For what purpose? Is the idea then they'll start being better teachers as a result of this higher salary? That brings up a troubling question. If you're a good teacher and you're not providing the best possible service, but suddenly if you get more money, now you're going to start providing a better service. Why weren't you providing it in the first place? So the question is a little troubling if that's what they're suggesting, that this $15,000 will actually produce better quality results. The other question is then, oh well, no, because there are good teachers out there, they just can't, they afford to be a teacher. We need to pay them more. So what are you saying about the current crop of teachers who are there now? Because you're saying, well, they're not good. We're going to move them out. We're going to bring in teachers, who are good. So again, it's very troubling in terms of if the point is to try and improve quality, I think it's very troubling, and it brings up a lot of questions about our current crop of our current education system.
Yeah, and I actually, so I'm kind of somewhere in between on that, mostly because not because I think that teachers don't deserve a raise, or that there are no good teachers out there or bad teachers, or even that the ones that are already doing that are not incentivized in one way, shape, or form by money, or would be more willing, say, to invest more, emotionally and internally into their classroom, into their students if they had that. I'm not even saying that's not the case. The problem, though, being, again, and I feel like we always come back to this because, obviously we believe it, wholeheartedly. We come back to this case where our education system is still designed in a one-size-fits-most thing, and then we kind of clean up around the edges with students with severe special needs and disabilities.
So we're teaching to the lowest common denominator. Is that what you're kind of referencing?
Well, not even, because we have gifted tracks too, but even gifted tracks, we approach that with a fairly myopic focus too. And so we basically say you're either typical, special needs, or gifted, and then we have different schools have different programs for that. The problem, though, is that even within those tiers, even within those tracks, students are so radically different from each other. They learn at different paces. They have different blind spots. They have different strengths. They have different opportunities for improvement. As long as we are promulgating a system where here comes the checklist, you need to do X, you need to do Y, you need to do Z. Oh, and then the feds now are jumping in and saying, oh, don't forget A, B, and C, because we all know how the Department of Education was so central to this nation's founding. Ironically, we would know if education was we would know the truth if the education was at a better level. But that being said, there's no diversification, or let me put it this way, no organic diversification, right? And this is why school choice is so important. There needs to be a mechanism whereby there can be experimentation. And look, you can't have natural experimentation if you just have, say you have an inner city school and you have individuals there who are beyond the general population, reading below level, at a greater percentage. There's no way, we could throw money at that and they put, okay, now we're doing, thumbs up for reading or whatever the program would be. But that might address a handful, but wouldn't address everybody. Why not unshackle the folks to be able to address that learning detriment in a way that's most appropriate for the specific student?
Right.
Now, we feel that's best helmed by the parent, obviously. But even so, we just put so many shackles, so many handcuffs on the actual education process itself. We're not getting any development, and then then the problem that this seeks to address is, why are things so stagnant? And it's that's the feature, not the bug, in the way this system's.
And I think you're hitting on the point, which is we're trying to improve. This is not a solution to trying to improve the education system, right?
Well, it's a solution to something.
I'm going to get to that. There are three problems that if you ask parents, if you ask Texans, what the biggest education issues are in the state. Number one is school safety. Number two is education quality, and number three is sort of the indoctrination question. The political agendas that are going on in the classroom. This, of course, doesn't solve anything about school safety. It doesn't solve anything about, preventing political agendas from coming into the classroom. And then to the extent that this even kind of addresses education quality, have kind of, spelled out the problems with saying that. This doesn't really incentivize anybody to be a better teacher necessarily. And so, and to your point, the system, there's problems in the system that this doesn't address. So I honestly, I'll just say it. I think this is a cynical play to try and destroy distract from the real debate that's going on about improving education, which is the one that you're talking about. Like, where do we create, reforms in the system? Is it accountability? Is it, is it flexibility? Is it getting rid of the regulations and the rules? This is a distraction from people who are trying to have the real debate and the real solutions and propose the real solutions that are going to address these issues of school safety, education quality, and making sure that we're teaching real academics in the classroom. And so while I think teachers should get paid more, my message is, to the folks out there fighting on this, keep your eye on the ball and keep pushing because this isn't the solution that is going to fix our education system.
Dance with the one that brought you.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll move on to our final segment of the show where we go in depth on a particular issue. This is, obviously a very controversial issue. It's something that has come on, I think, over the last couple of sessions. I think, I was even guilty of kind of relegating this to kind of being a fringe issue over the last couple of sessions. But obviously, there's been done a ton of research. There's been a lot of things have come to light on this issue of people who are promoting and pushing the gender modification of minors, and Texas is poised to act to prevent it. So would you go through, I don't know if you know, but would you go through maybe some of the legislative proposals that are out there?
Yeah, I can speak generally on ideas simply because we haven't seen yet something hit the hopper. Obviously, there's still plenty of time. But I do know that there is a decent amount of animation on this issue for the reasons that you mentioned. And simply put, this has been an area that had been roughly unshackled from kind of the general practice of medicine as we've seen it before. And obviously Dr. Quentin Van Meter, who we've had at our policy orientation prior to.
Shameless plug. I have another podcast. It's just an audio podcast. It's on Apple Podcasts and all those places called Brian's Breakdown. I did a 45-minute interview with Dr. Quentin Van Meter. He is a pediatric endocrinologist, which is just a fancy term for a guy who studies hormonal problems in children. So it's a 45-minute podcast, and he spells it all out. So I would highly recommend that. So
I was about to say, and I'd probably do poorly to hold a candle to that, but essentially, given the Reader's Digest version, is essentially, if you look at the juxtaposition of where, gender and mental health come, because we haven't had issues of gender dysphoria as a clinical thing, prior to, a little bit before our lifetimes, right? And essentially, that what was seen as kind of a fringe issue in the mental health space as kind of taken on a life of its own in this hyper-politicized medical environment that we have. Now, I do have to highlight that this is not one of this isn't settled science by any means. There is an activist group within the medical community that considers it such, but the larger medical community does not. And it really has been advancing what we would consider to be very contra Hippocratic Oath practices that are going on children who are unable to give or withhold consent, right? Mm-hmm. And so obviously we see this situation crop up. We were on the sidelines here for the longest time, mostly because this would be considered a quintessential social issue. And believe me, we got, like we've discussed already, there's plenty of other issues that bear addressing. But then we started hearing some of the solutions. And those solutions included usually using Child Protective Services in order to intercede in some of these cases gone awry. Mm-hmm.
Which and taking the kids away from the parents.
And I completely understand that impulse. The problem being, though, is our Child Protective Services are not exactly doing well. Mm-hmm. Our colleague Andrew Brown has been beating this drum for most of his professional career. We are unable to care for the kids the state needs to care for, let alone this whole new cohort. So that's almost as much of a non-starter as can be. But that being said, there are still people that wish to address it. So what mechanism can you address it through?
Right.
And the way I think a lot of this is going to go is simply a prohibition on the practice itself when visited upon minors. So whether we're talking about puberty blockers, whether we're talking about the actual surgical intervention, which, of course they say, though, that doesn't happen on children, then 8 examples come out of places doing it, not only that, but receiving state funds. And that's just, not consonant with the state of the medical science. In fact, if you look at these countries that have already gone down this path, the Western and Northern European countries, a lot of them now are walking back because they see it's irreversible. They see that it's that can have all sorts of tangential side effects problems as well. And that to do so to a child who, again, even when their parents, let me talk about their parents, though, because the view and what really animated folks saying, well, what we need to do is we need to take them, we need to put them in CPS and lock up the parents.
So take the kids away from the parents, put the parents in jail.
And I don't need to tell you this, Brian, if you're a parent and you see your child suffering, you will do absolutely anything. And, even if that means compromising some beliefs you may have had, you'd move heaven and earth to make that suffering stop. And that's where a lot of these parents are. It's not that they are, some left-wing gender crusaders who just want to,
Unfortunately, there are some. That
there
like
are
that,
definitely.
For sure. So we need to be careful, that some parents are, in fact,
absolutely. Though I'd say most parents, I think the influence that's kind of pushing a lot of individuals, a lot of children down this path, it's coming less from inside the home and more from inside the schools and another form of corrupt institutions. But that being said, I understand that impulse, and so turning a blind eye to the suffering would be wrong. What we need to be doing is addressing some of these things. One of the big things is when they talk about this is like, oh, well, this population has X greater of a percentage for attempting suicide and things like that. Those are comorbid functions. Those are not causal functions, right? And so one of the things that we need to be talking about is whatever underlying mental illness, whether severe or acute, we're addressing that right up front, where there are abilities for that to get fixed, because otherwise, if we're just reifying the gender side, and like if an adult wishes to go through this procedure, that, more power to them. But again, a child cannot give or withhold consent, and we're following bad science that's pursuant more to ideology in order to empower this. That needs to stop.
2 things to follow up on that. Quentin Van Meter, again, listen to the podcast. It's fascinating. It's riveting. I usually do only about 15 minutes, and we just kept going for like 45 minutes because it was so fascinating. He had so much good information. One of the big takeaways I got from that interview was he said, gender dysphoria is real. No one's saying gender dysphoria is not real. It is absolutely a real thing. It is rare, but it is a real thing. And the solution, the vast majority of the time, the solution is puberty. If you can get a child through puberty and they can get over the dysphoria and their body will tell them who they are and what they really are and all of that. Look, if they decide as an adult at that point, after they get through puberty, to decide to do whatever they want to do with their own body, that's fine. But let's let the child get through puberty, and there's counseling and other ways that we can do that to help the child and the parent. So
absolutely.
Very important on that. Also, you mentioned Andrew Brown, who's done the research on this. We published a research paper, I guess it was before last summer, last year, getting ready for this issue. So. And the real takeaways for me on that, which I want to share with our audience, number one, we looked at all this. You mentioned, what's going on in Europe and what's going on here in the country. There is no conclusive evidence that these hormone therapies, that the puberty blockers, and then certainly these irreversible surgeries, there's no conclusive evidence at all that shows that it actually helps the dysphoria, right? Like, think about, if the child has dysphoria and you're going through and your solution is these things, you would think that it would, that the point would be to alleviate the dysphoria. There's no evidence that any of these things actually help the patient get through the dysphoria. So that's number one. There is significant evidence, of course, that the puberty blockers and all of that do physically and emotionally harm the children. And you mentioned, suicide rates. People who actually transition have very high suicide rates. So we do have no evidence that this actually helps. We have lots of evidence that it actually hurts. And so without conclusive evidence that that these things are working, doctors are effectively experimenting on children. And that's really what this is. You mentioned the parents, and so we do have solutions, and we want to, to your point about, you have scared parents who are just looking for solutions. That's why, I think our legislative or our solutions, our policy solutions are to try and get parents and kids through and into, some kind of counseling so that they can get discussions. But, and professional counseling is another takeaway from the research. Professional counseling has been a proven alternative that does in fact help kids overcome the dysphoria. So it actually is a solution to the problem.
Yeah, and this is a heartbreaking area to discuss too. And I think that, again, so much of our politics nowadays is we want to retreat to our camps and put on the red team shirt or the blue team shirt, and then run our playbook accordingly. And this is one where lives are literally at stake, and getting it wrong on the front end has a lot of cascading problems. So this is one of the solutions where love is, loving your opponent, your ideological opponent is the only way out. This is not something where, we want this tax rate, they want that tax rate, and we're going to beat each other over the head. This is real. These are real people.
So no announcements have been made as of this morning whenever we were talking about this issue, but we do believe that legislation is poised to be released fairly soon, and this will be an issue that will be taken up in both the House and the Senate and pursued through the various committees. So we will keep an eye on that issue. All right. Well, that's it for this episode. We really enjoyed talking about all these issues. Again, we would love to have your feedback. You can get us out in the Twitterverse, me at Real Beefil, and you can get Derek at Cohen at TPPF. Also, another reminder, next week's show, very exciting. Our very first guest ever on the show is going to be former Congresswoman Myra Flores. She's going to have lots to say about all the topics of the day, so we're really looking forward to that. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. As always, in the words of Sam Houston, do good and suffer the consequences.